thank you for taking the time out today to hear more about your compliance obligations, things that you need to be thinking about within your dealership. I first have to ensure that I read the legal disclaimer. It's for educational purposes. This webinar should not be construed as legal advice. As always, please consult with your outside counsel in determining the appropriate course of action. There will be a couple of times in the webinars where we'll defer and suggest that you adapt outside opinions. Okay, so today we're going to talk about things that your dealership needs to have in place today. You may have a couple of these in place already or think that you have those in place, but you really need to have policies, written policies in place and be adhering to those policies, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Red flag, risk-based pricing notices, adverse action notices. Then we'll open it up for questions and answers. The webinar piece should take about 30-35 minutes. I'm going to cover things fairly quickly, and certainly if there's anything you missed or would like to hear again, you can do that at the end. There is a portion on the right in the toolbar for questions, and we'll take as much time as we need. Okay. In presenting these policies and procedures in the products, I like to, the reasoning behind some of these regulations. What is behind the laws? Why were they put in place? And they all were for protection of the consumer. The red flag policy was to help fight and protect consumers' identity and help fight identity theft. Ensure that the person sitting in front of you is who they say they are. And we hear quite frequently how, this product or our products do catch people applying for loans under false identities. And so it also helps stop theft of vehicles. Risk-based pricing notices was to educate consumers, make sure that they're aware of what their credit rating is, educate them a little bit on what a credit rating is, ensure that it's in line with what their perception is of their own credit history, so that if there's a difference in their perception versus reality, they know how to go check and ensure that the information is accurate in theirs. Then we have the adverse action, which is the original regulation from the FCRA that anytime negative information exists on a consumer and was utilized in making a decision and affect that decision adversely, that they need to be made aware of, again, so that they can ensure that that information is accurate and theirs. So we're going to start with going over red flag, and we hit red flag first because the government was very specific about what a dealership needs to have in place. And it specifically refers to dealerships in the regulation. It refers to them as arrangers of credit, which means you're part of that credit transaction. It's not just the lender. You are considered an arranger of credit because you're dealing with multiple lenders and arranging financing for the consumer through multiple lenders. It's very specific about what the dealer has to have in place, their programs, and so we use that as a guideline as to all the programs, what you need to have in place for those programs. It does state that dealers are required by law to have a written identity theft protection policy, so policies and procedures in place, referred to as an ITPP. The policy must have a training component, a monitoring component, a reporting component, and an audit component. So these are all components that you need to be ensured your dealership has in place, and training so that, when there's employee transition, you're training the employees on what they must be doing in regards to red flags. And it also states you must have a compliance officer defined and in place. And actually, the formal ITPP has to name them and have them sign the policy and procedure. So one of our takeaways is to make sure that you've defined someone within your dealership to take responsibility for these policies, become educated, and identify the gaps. We do have a program in place here at 700 Credit that will help you with that. You take a checklist through your dealership. What do you have in place? What don't you have? What do you need? That's our compliance product. So the red flag regulation states that your red flag program product must have some key components. One is an OFAC database check. Many of you have had this in place for years, and we come across dealerships all the time that have a red flag program and an OFAC, and the OFAC is also included in their red flag, so you can do a little self-check there. OFAC is included in red flag, most red flag products, so if you're still pulling OFAC separately, but you're also including it in the red flag, you can eliminate the individual OFAC, but make that verification first. You must do an address verification against a public record database. So you're taking the name and address of the applicant and verifying that that name and address exists in a public record database. You must also do a fraud database check against known fraud databases. There's many of them out there. Our product includes several known addresses with fraudulent activity in the past, mail drops, prisons. Also must check a master death file and perform Social Security validation. And your program must also have an ID verification component. This is the component where you're verifying the ID. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm sure most of you are capturing images of driver's license today, but are you doing the verification component and recording that you're doing the verification component, so that if you're audited, or how do you monitor something or audit it yourself if you're not recording that you're doing these things? We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So with red flags, when we're doing public record database searches and verifying names and addresses or fraudulent databases, you're going to find things in the fraudulent databases. You're going to find name and address discrepancies. What do you do? Your program must define what you do in these instances, and they're very common. We see anywhere from 10, 20% address discrepancies, because some of these databases take a long time to update once someone moves. Could be anywhere from 60 to 90 days between when someone moves and their address is updated everywhere it needs to be. So what do you do when there's an address discrepancy? Remember, we have to define that. So there's manual methods. Most of the manual methods are similar things that you need to do when you're renewing your driver's license or you lost your driver's license. You have to provide additional forms of verification in addition to a driver's license. You're going to need copies of utility bills to verify, again, your address. The problem with this is that the consumers, when shopping for cars, very rarely show up with the dealership with all these items, and we don't want them to leave the dealership. The other problem is when you do manual verifications, again, you have to audit, review, and monitor. So you have to make sure that you have processes in place to record, what additional forms of identification were provided, and how did you verify them. Most products that are out there in the industry, one of the things to keep in mind as well is all three of these products that we're reviewing today, including the red flag, they're tied to credit data. So, where you need to be looking is where you're purchasing your credit information from. The system that you're pulling credit within, that's the system that must provide the red flag product. And the other thing to look for in the system, as we mentioned, we don't want the consumer to leave the dealership, is the ability to pull out of wallet questions. And most systems out there today do allow for this. These are questions and answers. Again, remember, the purpose is to verify that the person sitting in front of me is who they say they are. So by providing out-of-wall questions to the consumer and having them provide answers, correct answers, is a valid way to validate the identity. And some of you might have seen these questions and answers pop up maybe when you're looking at your own credit on the internet. I know finance institutions are using them now and applying online, but they're questions only the consumer would know the answer to, addresses they've lived at previously, counties, cars that they've owned, or maybe loans that they've had, who the financial institutions have had. But it's a very accurate way. And again, the consumer does not have to lead the dealership to do this, and you should have the ability to generate these and respond to these right within the application where you're pulling credit. Okay. The last component is ID verification. And again, this is where auditing gets tricky. It's very specific about what you must do every time a consumer presents their ID to you. It must be, and you must validate that it is a form of government identification. It has to appear unaltered. The image and physical description of the applicant is consistent, so it looks like them. Height, weight, eye color is consistent with the application, with the ID, and the ID information must match the application. So if you're capturing a form of ID and it doesn't match the name and address on the app, and you're not validating that name and address on the app, you violated the policy. So how do you put these things in place and audit this? I've seen people make a checklist out of paper, put it in the deal jacket, and make sure that the finance manager is checking these things before the deal is signed. We provide an electronic list. You can pop it up, check the boxes. That way we're capturing the date, the time, the name of the person who did it. And so you have an audit report. That's something you can monitor and report on as a way to proceed. So what's at stake with all these regulations? It's a per occurrence violation. With red flag, it's $3,500. So if you don't have a policy in place, you just think about how many cars you've sold, and that would be a violation, $3,500 per instance. So it can get pretty steep pretty quick. They are not going to accept walking into a dealership if your dealership is audited either by the government or states. We're hearing of several states that are doing dealership audits now. Not having a policy in place is not acceptable, or saying you weren't aware is no longer acceptable. And even if you have a policy in place that has gaps, but you have it in place and you're following it and you have a good program in place, they're going to be much more lenient if they see that maybe your policy has a gap that they'd like you to fill. You might get audited again in a year, but at least they're going to be lenient and probably minimal fines. So things with each of these programs, we're going to have this slide, and there's a little redundancy there, so that by the end I'm going to be going over it real quick, but things that your dealership must have in place. So you have to have a document on the premise that defines your policies for red flags, otherwise known as the Identity Theft Protection Program. It needs to define in each system where you're pulling credit, how you're performing red flags, and if you need to remediate, how you're remediating it. Who is going to be performing those red flag checks, how they're going to be monitoring them, what reporting they're going to be providing and auditing they're going to be doing at a monthly basis. Retain the proof of the audits. The reporting must be to senior level management. So you have to have those things in place. And it must cover 100% of your applicants. So you have to think, and one of the recommendations, takeaways today will be, consolidate where you're pulling credit. If you're pulling credit today, let's say in Dealertrack, just because you have a web app, maybe you have a finance credit application, you don't have to pull credit in that web finance credit application. You can just push that data to Dealertrack and pull the credit in Dealertrack. If you're pulling credit in 700 credit, the same logic applies. Push your apps into 700 credit, pull all your credit from within 700 credit, because you want to minimize, first of all, the policies you have to define, your audits, your reporting, and your exposure, points of failure. You want to minimize your points of failure. And ensure that you define who's going to monitor it, audit it, and that's all things that your compliance officer must define. Things to look for in your credit reporting solution. Again, where are you pulling credit from? Make sure that your system, tracks that a red flag was pulled and the outcome was a success, or did something occur? Was there a deviation that you need to remediate? And make sure that electronically it's capturing this, and so that the reporting makes auditing and monitoring easy on your dealership. So you want to track these things, make sure they have reports that support the events that occur. You want to look to see if your provider provides an identity theft protection program, an example, or something that you can model your own on. And then you want to ensure that the system does have the capability to automate those out-of-wallet questions, and that's incorporated into your program. Your employees are trained in using them. So I'm just going to show you some samples of our products so you can see what a red flag looks like. Here's our red flag summary. It should be on the top of every credit report, as you can see on the bottom of the screen. You can see here the 4 sections of the law that we outlined: an OFAC check, an ID match, a red flags alerts, which is the database checks, and then the manual ID verification. We also have a confidence score that's going to tell you the confidence of the person sitting in front of you is who they say they are. Here you can see there was an alert, so it has to be remediated. You can do this manually, or you can, again, select the out-of-wallet questions here. Those would pop up, you'd answer them, and you would get an okay to proceed. We also have a verify ID, so that and it's going to basically pop up a checklist of the questions that you need to ask, and you answer them, and it's going to retain who did it, when they did it. We also have a dashboard, a compliance dashboard. It's available within not only our 700 dealer platform, but it's also available within all the affiliate systems that we're integrated with, the CRMs, DMSs that have our integration toolkit, so that you can pop up the dashboard. This tool helps satisfy your monitoring component and your reporting component. You can see here there's a red flag monitor section where we're going to indicate, what red flags occurred, were they resolved, and you can click right from here and go to those not resolved and resolve them. You can see things that you also have to monitor that are, again, available within the credit report, fraud victim and security alerts. Did the consumer say that their file had been compromised? And in light of recent events in our industry regarding Equifax, you can see, where these could be about to elevate. Also monitoring active duty alerts. So if a consumer is in active duty, you have to really verify that they are who they say they are, because we have to protect the servicemen, but also how could they be in active duty and applying for a car. We're then monitoring the manual verifications, how many were complete, incomplete, and then OFAC hits, and if there were any hits. Okay, so that's the red flag program. Again, if you have questions, note them or pre-populate the questions on the box. We're going to move on to risk-based pricing notices. Again, what the definition of risk-based pricing, I guess the 30,000-foot view is that the terms that are offered to a consumer are based on their score and other factors. But the better your score, the better the APR that you're going to obtain versus a low score is going to get a higher APR. So the score plays an important role in defining what your payment's going to be, what car you can afford, and what your interest rate is. So it's important that consumers are aware of their score and the impacts of their score. When the risk-based pricing notice first came out, regulation first came out, it stated you did not have to pull it on all your consumers, just those that there was a substantial portion of your customers had to be provided with the risk-based pricing, but determining what a substantial portion is very complicated, and you have to audit it on a regular basis and define it, and there's no way to automate it. And I think the government realized that with the help of NADA. So they came out with an alternative program, and you can see again they refer to dealers as arrangers of credit and a participating creditor. So when it first came out, we still get questions from dealers. I didn't think I had to provide it to every consumer. Well, you do. The government came out with the exception notice. And they said, okay, you can use this notice, but the caveat is you have to provide it to everyone who you pull a credit report on. And that actually makes things very easy for dealerships to audit, to report on, and to deliver. And we're gonna talk about that a little bit. But they were very specific. You know, most risk-based pricing notices look alike because they gave an example of a notice and they said you can't even deviate from the font size of this notice. This is what we want you to use. So it's actually, you know, it is very educational to the consumer. It includes their score, the bureau that was used, the name of the scorecard that was used, the range of the scores of that scorecard. It gives the consumer a graphical representation of where they rank nationally, so it's very easy for them to determine, do I have good credit, do I have bad credit, and does that align with my perception? So it's educating them on the score, educating them on where they rank nationally, and then if their score doesn't align with their perception, it tells them, you know, where they can go to get a free copy of their credit report. The consumer is allowed to get a free copy of their credit report once a year from each of the 3 bureaus. It tells them how to do that. It also tells them if after they do that if there's information that is inaccurate, is not theirs, or reported inaccurately, how to dispute it, where to go, who to contact to dispute that information. What's at stake here again is an individual fine of each breach, you know, and you don't want to be out of compliance. Again, if you're audited and it deems that you don't even have a policy in place, you're going to get hit pretty hard. Or if your policy doesn't cover, if you have significant gaps, again, you know, this is a report that's provided by your credit provider because it contains information from the credit report. If you're pulling credit from multiple providers and multiple systems, it makes your auditing and putting policies in place very difficult. Documents or items that your dealership must have in place: a document that defines your policy, where you're pulling credit, how is that notice being generated and delivered to the consumer, you know, whose responsibility is to deliver the notice, where is it delivered in the process, and does it cover, again, 100% of your applicants. We come across dealers all the time that, no, I'm compliant with risk-based pricing. They're pulling credit reports maybe within eLeads using our utility, but they're using a third party's web app somewhere that, you know, it's an online credit application that's pushing credit apps and it's not pushing them into eLeads, and it's just sort of hanging out there, and they're not delivering notices. So make sure that every place that you're pulling credit reports from, you're delivering notices. So things you want to look for, again, in a credit reporting solution, you want to make sure that you're aware of where the risk-based pricing notices is, where it's generated, how it's generated, so you can train your employees and define that in your policy. There's another important feature that that we have, and I know some others have as well, and that's a backstop approach. You want to make sure, you want to look at an approach that you have the ability to print or email the notices from within your dealership, but then have a mail house behind it, so that if for some reason a notice isn't printed and delivered to the consumer or emailed to the consumer, there's a mail house behind that that's going to pick those up and mail those. It's very important. So now you can guarantee you're 100% compliant. Right? You want to retain that, how they were delivered. Now I can provide an audit report that says, here are the credit reports I pulled, here are the notices that were printed and handed to the consumer, here are those that were emailed, and here are those that were mailed by the mail house, but it's 100%. Again, here's an example of a risk-based pricing notice from our system. You can see at the top, in this instance, we display 3 scorecards from Experian. We use the 700 score to tell the consumer where they rank nationally. You can see here they're in the top 56 percentile. You can see a little bit, you can see that the way it's phrased, understanding, what should you know about your credit score, how we use your credit score, the range of scores, and then if you scroll down in this, you would see that other information I mentioned about how to obtain a free copy, how to dispute information if it isn't accurate. Again, we have our compliance dashboard here, and we have a risk-based pricing program monitor section, and in here you can see we've had some updates to this. This isn't the most recent copy, but you see notices printed locally here at 0. Oops. I apologize. Hang on one second. My PowerPoint decided to quit. Back up in 1 second. Okay, apologize for that. So the number of notices that were printed locally, the number that are in a queue to be mailed. So they're queued to be mailed, and that's why we can say risk-based pricing notices delivered or scheduled to be delivered is at 100%. So this would mean that you're conforming. You don't have any that were mailed yet. You don't have any that were printed locally yet. There's 0% here. The red percent here shows what percentage of consumers aren't scheduled to have one mailed or printed or emailed. We've also added a line here, notices emailed. So what you're monitoring and reporting on is that 100% were delivered. Okay, we're going to talk about adverse action notices. So 15, 20 years ago, if you talk to a dealer about adverse action notices, they would say, well, my finance institution mails them, so I don't have to. Not an accurate statement at all. The finance institution has their own obligations to mail adverse action if they're offering counteroffers that the consumer doesn't accept, or they just outright decline someone. They have their own obligations. The dealership has their own adverse action responsibilities, so when they pull credit, they must be delivering adverse action notices. And again, the dealer is considered an arranger of credit, participators in credit. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Where does adverse occur in my dealership? Opinions are all over, but I think they've really started to fine tune based on the dealer association, state associations, all sort of coming to the same conclusion on where adverse occurs in the dealership. But we definitely recommend what I recommend to several dealerships is, get an adverse action definition of where it occurs in the dealership from a state association or even a reputable law firm. and include that in your policy or procedure that you're going to define in your dealership, so that if you are audited, you based your policy on a well-founded opinion. You didn't just define it on your own. You based it on an opinion, and you defined your policy around that opinion. I know NADA has a very good one. NIADA has a very good one. And there's external law firms that have white papers such as Hudson Cook. But you do have to have a policy in place. Again, just like the previous two, you have to have a policy in place. If you don't, I believe this one is open for civil suits. So what you don't, or class action, and that word always scares me because they don't need to find much, and then they want to bring everybody in on it. So again, everybody's interpretation varies a little bit. Again, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about best practice. Some of the things that we see, you might be delivering adverse action notices for, to everybody that you pull a credit report and didn't sell a car to. I think that's a little bit too wide of a net. You don't want to be sending adverse action notices to your 800 credits if they decided not to buy a car, because they may never come back. Every customer from whom the dealership obtains a credit report and is declined by the dealer. So in other words, someone comes in, you pull their credit and they're a 425, they got an open bankruptcy, and you don't have a finance institution that would lend to that. So you determine, I don't have anybody I can send you to. All right, that is an obvious part of the policy that your policy must include. You declined a consumer based on their credit. You didn't forward them to a finance institution. You must deliver an adverse action notice in that situation. But it's not broad enough of a policy, but it needs to be part of your policy. Every customer from whom the dealership obtains a credit report below a score cutoff, again, that's a little bit too broad, but the score is we recommend the best practice. How a score is used is that, and I'll get into that in a second, but a score is used to define, whether or not you're going to send it to your primary lender. Everybody has that primary lender, that finance source that they would prefer to send a deal to. And that's typically, there's score cutoff parameters around that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. When does adverse occur? So we talked about the first, you take a credit application, they cannot find a buyer for the installment sales contract, so you're unable to offer financing to the consumer. Obviously, that's where it occurs. The second piece is they apply for credit on such terms such as APR, or maybe you have a 0% program or red carpet lease, and you pull their credit report and you determine that they're not going to qualify, but you have another lender that will have a program for them, right? We do this all the time. Maybe we'll shoot it to 7 or 8 dealers or 7 or 8 finance institutions from within DealerTrack or Route 1. So we're trying to get them the best, lowest rate possible. But we didn't send them to our primary lender. So that's considered a counteroffer. I'm trying to find alternative financing and make them a counteroffer. So the interpretation of the regulation is that when a counteroffer occurs and the consumer declines that counteroffer, that's an adverse event. And if they decline that counteroffer, and that's where the policies come that someone doesn't buy a car from me, I need to send them an adverse action notice. So that primary lender can typically be defined by a score cutoff. This is how we help dealers automate it. The regulation states that you must provide an adverse action notice who declines the counteroffer. Anyone at that point you do not sell a car to. This can be automated, and we automate it for dealers all the time. The way we automate it is we'll define their primary lender cutoff criteria. Anybody below that cutoff criteria, we will mark that needs to receive an adverse action notice, and then we can upload your sold auto list and demark those that you sold a car to. And everybody else, either you print, email, or our mail house will mail to. So that automates it and ensures 100% compliance. So back to what a dealership, again, you have to have a policy in place that defines all your systems, where you pull credit, how adverse action notices now again contain information from the credit report, so it needs to be generated from the system you pull credit in. So you have to define it for each system, who's going to deliver it, whose responsibility is it to monitor, audit, and again, it must cover 100% of your applicants. Notice civil penalty in red, which means it can be a class action, which we don't want, and get real steep and real costly real quick. Again, features to look for: where you're pulling credit, ask where you're pulling credit, how are the letters generated, do they have a way to automate it, and what are the reporting features that support my program. You know, how, if at the end of the month I want to print a report, I need to see everybody I should have received a notice, and did they receive that notice. Also, retention. You want to make sure, understand the letter retention, not just the credit report retention. We don't delete anything here at 700 Credit, but you need to make sure. I have seen where some of these reports are only available for 30, 60 days, but somebody's audited a year later and they got to go back the previous year. If that's the situation, make sure you're printing copies of your reports and retaining them. Here's a copy of our adverse action notice. You can see, it includes indication of which bureaus it was pulled on, where to contact the bureau. There's information further down in the report around the score. There's the reason codes that aligned with the scorecard, the actual score, bureau. So there is information from the credit report. If you're using our system, you can find those tabs at the top of your screen. If they're not being generated, contact us. We can ensure we turn that on. You can also hit request setup changes. That'll get someone to call you. And again, there's a monitor, letters mailed, emailed, queued to be mailed, how many were printed locally, by who, date and time. So you want, again, those audit reportings and the monitoring tools in place in the system you're pulling credit from today. A couple other policies that we're starting to see. You should have a privacy policy. We have the ability to print these within our system, but they don't change. They're not based on credit information. So what I typically see is that the dealer will have a pad of these and present one or hand one to the consumer, or maybe even have them sign one and hand it back. But what you're doing with their information, who you share it with, your policy at a dealership doesn't change, so the policy can remain the same. Information security, which is becoming big, and protection from hackers. And the government is starting to come down that every dealership has to have an information security policy. How often are your users required to change passwords, make sure that their screens are locked when they leave their monitors unattended for more than a minute. Make sure you're training your employees on these policies around, information safeguarding. Also, most of the policies today contain education around protection security in terms of viruses and different types of viruses and how to protect against them and how to keep a lookout. Good programs to have in place, because you don't want to have your system compromised. Ships have audit lists of all their service providers and ask to review their security policies that they have on file to ensure that they're in compliance. So if you're using eLeads, ask them for they have a policy that they'll circulate. Data breach policy. What you need to do as a dealership, you need to have a program in place that if there is a breach at your dealership, what's your course of action? You have to notify the consumers. You have to provide them with credit monitoring, or the ability to opt into credit monitoring, so that they can monitor their file and also utilize that service to update their data if it was compromised. So just a recap on some of the takeaways here. We're going to open it up for questions here in a couple of seconds. You know, we can't walk away, do nothing. Make sure you appoint a compliance officer, you know, have them attend this webinar, obtain a copy of the webinar. Anybody that would like a copy, just email. You can email support at 700 credit, webinar at 700 credit. And reply to any of the follow-up emails that you will receive from this webinar. You know, make sure you define a compliance officer and review what you have in place, identify the gaps. I mentioned we have a service that will help you identify the gaps. Consolidate where you're pulling credit from, identify those places, and make sure you have a written policy for each of these programs in place for each of the places where you're pulling credit. You know, you want to automate your solutions. Don't be reliant on people performing unless you have really good audit procedures in place. You know, get compliant and stay compliant. It might sound like a task and maybe a cost initially, but it's really not compared to what could happen if there is an audit does occur. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions and answers.